Mirror's Edge will not be remembered 10 years from now. It's not going to be looked back on as one of the greats. It's not a pillar on which the next generation of games rests, and it will be lucky to be remembered at all by most people, let alone recalled by name instead of just as that parkour game. The Mirror's Edge games are flawed. These games have had so many missteps, both large and small. Some things they tried, experimented with, and it just didn't work out. Other things were just straight failures to succeed on basic expected aspects of a standard game. But for what they are, good and bad, I love these games. They do have flaws, but Mirror's Edge also has an identity all its own. It has this vibe, this feeling, a sensation I've never quite experienced from any other game. The music, the aesthetic, the gameplay all come together to put me on this line where I can almost imagine myself to really be in this city, in this world. I've walked the streets of my town in the dead of night when it's quiet and lonely, where after you get over how strange it is to be in these public places that are normally so crowded and bustling, you get this sense of, I can go anywhere I want to. So if you're me, you start running around, climbing over fences and on pipes to get to rooftops, exploring to get to these spots where you can just look down on the city and feel like you've got a perspective on it that few have quite seen before. Now, I'll admit that's more just urban exploration than freerunning or parkour, but while I do really enjoy running around from rooftop to rooftop in these games, linking together fluid movements as quickly as I can, I think that the entire package of these games coming together to give me that certain sense of place, the specific vibe of having the freedom to move through a quiet rooftop as I please, is what will stick with me the most. And the fact that those rooftops in these games also happen to look like my favorite computer wallpapers that I would stare at when my head is in the clouds and my mind is relaxed with music and sound to complement just makes it all the better. So yes, these games have problems, but they do a lot well too, and they completely rock their style. I don't know how much public appeal they have, and I imagine that even if they were perfect in most of the ways they could be, they still wouldn't have seen the kind of recognition that many of the hallmark games of the medium have. At the end of the day, these are games about running over and around obstacles. They're about simply going from one place to the other. Despite what feels like an obligatory inclusion, they're not about tight, intense gunplay or combat. They're not about role-playing. They're not about loot grinding or leveling up with intricate, detailed character paths. They're not about telling an emotional, gripping story. Mirror's Edge is about being there. Or maybe like racing around on foot for some people, I don't know. But even then, there is not a sprawling fantasy landscape dotted with things to do or people to meet. Instead, just different kinds of walls to run on and blocks to jump off of. So what I'm getting at is that these games are at least a little bit on the niche side of things in my mind. At least at their core, I think that it's kind of a niche thing. But they succeeded at getting this core to work, the idea of feeling like a traceur, a practitioner of parkour, dancing over rooftops. It gets this right. The heavy footsteps, the breathing of somebody pushing their body to the limit, the lighting, the controls, for the most part, the environments. It comes together well, and it leaves an impression if you're one to appreciate that niche gameplay focal point of being a
traceur.
Now, the developers of the game, DICE or their publisher EA, probably EA, were very aware that this core idea of a game was experimental and unproven, which is why we see the implementation of things like firearms and unnecessary skill trees. These are the concessions that had to be made for a game like this to be developed by a AAA studio with all of the polish that comes with that. And to be fair, having something else to do aside from run and jump places is probably a good idea so that you don't get fatigued of the same gameplay loops, just to have something else to mix things up a bit. Combat doesn't have to be an inherently bad thing for these kinds of games. The second one, Mirror's Edge Catalyst, really tried to understand what worked and didn't work about the firearms and the combat in the first title, and tried to cater it a lot more carefully to the kind of game that Mirror's Edge is. They still failed in a lot of ways, but I think that conceptually what they were trying to do is what I would consider to be a near perfect combat system for something like this. It just had a ton of problems in execution, but it was still really nice to see them take the criticisms that people had with the first one into account and think hard about how combat should work for Mirror's Edge and function in a way to reinforce the core mechanics instead of working against them. But I'm getting off topic a bit. I'll come back to this, especially to Catalyst later, because I think it's just straight up a better game than the first. But yeah, combat was always going to be a thing if this game was to be made in the environment that it was. And as unique and refreshing as this game was at its core, it already was playing into a lot of consumer preference in its design. You know, cashing in on the whole parkour thing in the first place, pretty much. This doesn't mean that the developers didn't have passion for the project, of course. or that it still shouldn't be praised for being a unique departure from the usual kinds of games that were popular at the time, but it was still a title trying to capitalize on a growing fad in the US, and was part of the very conscious push from EA to essentially say, hey, check it out, we can totally make new IPs and stuff. We don't just do sports sequels and war sequels, guys. Around the same point in time, EA was releasing Rock Band, Skate, Mass Effect and Dragon Age, Boom Blocks, Dead Space, none of which had the number 2 or 3 or colon subtitle at the end of their name. And this was also a point where parkour and freerunning were starting to really catch on in America and Europe. On the internet and places like YouTube, you could suddenly start finding thousands of tutorials on how to perform a basic tic-tac or a cat leap, not to mention all the freerunning highlight compilation videos. It seemed inevitable that somebody would come out with a game all about it sooner or later, but what wasn't such a certainty was the idea that such a game would be in the first person. One of the principal design elements of Mirror's Edge was its commitment to keeping you locked into this perspective, so that even though the acrobatics you were performing were relatively mundane compared to a lot of other video games, it still felt intense, it felt engrossing, and it could be nerve-wracking and rewarding. It could also be incredibly nausea-inducing, and my heart goes out to anyone that couldn't play these games because of this, and I'm also sorry for not using crosshairs in any of the footage for this video. I'd also like to apologize for VR becoming a big deal, since that's pretty cool. Moving around and handling the character felt good, and it felt responsive. The game found a pretty good spot between having a skill curve with enough room to allow the player to learn how to flow through the rooftops gracefully and feeling accomplished for doing that, but also making the experience simple and cathartic enough to be able to pick up for the first time and feel like a super badass
Dresseur.
I've seen some people express a desire for more moves to be able to perform, which I never really understood. You have an option for being able to traverse just about anything you'll find lying around. Jumps, coiled jumps, rolls, slides, wall runs, vaults, pop vaults. Given that you have techniques to get anywhere that's not more than a 12-foot high sheer wall face, I don't know what I would say is missing. All of the actions you can perform in Mirror's Edge chain into each other well and smoothly too, and they feel good linking from one to the next. I don't think I've ever felt like it needed some kind of ability that I didn't have. Even looking at the next game, Mirror's Edge Catalyst, adding variety to the moveset ended up being getting some new gadgets to play around with instead of giving Faith new moves. And there are small little techniques you can begin to pick up on, even outside of like the speedrunning techniques, of course, which are just ridiculous, that just add to your already sufficient toolbox and keep traversal interesting beyond the first playthrough if you have enough interest in figuring them out. Learning when and where to use certain moves is the point where you really start to see how this can be a game of skill for sure, separating it from just being an experience like how some of the same kinds of jumps and platforming might be used in other games. You have the ability to get better at Mirror's Edge as a learnable, improvable skill, as a game, the same way you could with a fighting game or a traditional shooter or frickin' tennis or something. Learning not only to recognize which paths through any given environment are the quickest and most efficient, but finding all the little tricks with the movement that you can do to just be a little bit faster and perfecting those tricks. That is Mirror's Edge to some people. Some people even consider Mirror's Edge to be racing games, which is a camp I'm not part of myself, but I can get where they're coming from. The developers of the game didn't miss the obvious connection either. The one other mode in this game, the one other thing you can do aside from play through the very short story, is race. You can race through each chapter of the story, or you can compete in smaller time trials through only a select rooftop or section from the story missions. The shorter length of these time trials in particular forces you to really learn how to maximize each step you take for speed to keep things tight and efficient, since they're so short that smaller increments of time, down to milliseconds, can mean the difference between first place and 1000th place on your leaderboards. Now, I wouldn't blame anybody if they just couldn't get into this facet of the game at all. I completely understand how retrying what can often be the same 3-second stretch of a level over and over again can sound more like some kind of experimental new torture method than a fun activity to do in your leisure time, but I would recommend giving at least a couple trials a shot even if you don't think you'll be into it, especially if you've got friends to compete against, as the global leaderboards will almost certainly be too high above your level to be encouraging and fun to compare to. That said, if you don't care about improving your rad ninja skills and just want to casually coast along and enjoy the story, there's nothing wrong with that. Unlike the story itself, which there's plenty wrong with. I won't go into crazy detail about it because the stories in these games just are not what they are about for me, and it's really not interesting to even discuss their faults, but in general, nobody that played Mirror's Edge really thought the story was very good. It's just underdeveloped, the pacing is off, the characters are flat, it's derivative, and it's just boring, dude. But that's not to say that the setting isn't great. The developers of this game clearly wanted to make something all about elegantly running and climbing around obstacles and whatnot, you know, parkour. So they're like, alright, well, we need to figure out what kind of setting we can make that is basically a modern free-running gym. What they came up with is this kind of Orwellian dystopian near future kind of deal. Everything is being monitored, so the only way to communicate with other people privately is by manually delivering messages. The setting does a good job at giving you a reason as to why your ability to climb stuff and slide under other stuff at a slightly accelerated pace compared to a normal person is relevant, and it at the same time excuses the abundance of conveniently climbable, flat, blocky structures with the art style. Everything is clean and sanitized in appearance, so when everything's got this crisp, minimalist vibe to it and everything is so simple and uniform, it doesn't seem so unreasonable that the rooftops would look the way they do. Of course, there is a threshold where you just can't see past the gameplay design abstractions of the levels, but I think that they did a good job with it. To keep such an otherwise boring location interesting, the game uses a very bold color palette, contrasting the stark, clean whites with vibrant, striking reds and blues and such. It all comes together to look really unique with a style all its own. The actual architecture doesn't change much throughout the game, so they end up using color as a way of spacing apart the different levels and places you go to so that it all doesn't run together in your minds. I couldn't tell you where exactly the different missions took place in the city, but I remember the green level or the really terrible blue level, for example. Of course, it would be better to simply have more level variety if you could, but in this corporate, homogenized, mass-produced feeling setting, it's a neat way to separate things visually. The aesthetic combined with the gameplay really do lend Mirror's Edge a feeling all of its own, and lead to it being surprisingly memorable even when most people at the time didn't think it was an amazing game. It was met with mixed reception when it was first released in 2008. General consensus seemed to be that the gameplay, that is the traversing the world and the parkour and all that, was good, along with the visuals, but the game was bogged down by the combat, the story, and the pacing. That is, the game had a tendency to do a few things that people didn't like. It would stop the high-speed running around for some environmental puzzle solving, it would be too confusing to navigate leading to a halt in the action, or it would have these sections that relied very heavily on trial and error. The last point I agree with completely. Well, mostly. Maybe not if you consider just certain tough jumps trial and error, but 100% agreed when it came to points in the games that were just crowded with enemies. Even when you were supposed to be running away or escaping a tense situation, the game just wouldn't give you enough time to piece together what you were supposed to be doing before you were gunned down and forced to retry, only giving you a couple moments each time to deduce what to do or where to go. The second point is similar. It's essentially the same thing, but in a calm backdrop when you're not being murdered. Instead of being punished with death in a few seconds of a loading screen, you just have to sit there as confusion and boredom begin to take over. I can't honestly remark on this point very well myself, because I simply remembered the paths through this game too well from playing it over and over in my childhood. So instead though, I will say that I think the game really stumbles with guiding the player in general, I guess. It had this system, which they call runner vision, that's designed to prevent this exact kind of confusion, and personally I think that this system ruins a lot of the fun of the game. There's already a separate hint button that makes your character look at where you need to go, so it's not like you'd be hung out to dry without being able to see the exact route the developers intended you to use through any given area. Instead of looking over a path and deciding for yourself which way you want to take through it, it just becomes a game of following this bright red breadcrumb trail and then maybe getting lost when you lose track of it, apparently, according to some reviewers. I wish that the levels were designed to be a bit more open and without relying on this as a crutch. Instead, offering more options on how to get to the end so that if the player fails to see one path, they still have a chance of finding the other ones. Instead, the game considers this visual aid a matter of difficulty instead of preference, disabling it entirely on the hardest setting, which is just not what it should be. It's like some RPG disabling your minimap if you play on hard mode instead of it just being a "do you want this on or off" option in the menu. I think it would be better served as an option that you have to specifically enable instead of being the other way around. And then, again, ideally the level design could just be a bit easier to navigate. Finally, the last point about the pacing that people had issue with was having to stop for some light puzzle solving. This I just disagree with. I don't think the game is a racing game, and while I acknowledge that fluidly gliding over rooftops at high speeds is quite fun, breaking things up and giving you chances to relax a bit and mellow out is what keeps those faster parts so enjoyable. I don't think there's anything wrong with slowing down the gameplay every once in a while, especially since you're still using all the tools and mechanics that you've been practicing with up until now in these sections. You simply have to take a look over the area and figure out exactly where to use those tools, is all. So, as far as public reception goes, that brings us to the combat. Probably the single most disliked thing about the game. Definitely the thing people bring up most when discussing its problems, at least. And yeah, the combat isn't good. It feels weak, it feels tacked on. In the same way that you need slower beats in the gameplay over time for the sake of good pacing, I get that you need to ratchet up the intensity sometimes too, more than what just a couple super long, scary jumps can provide. And of course, I've already mentioned that I think the gunplay and combat was always going to be crowbarred into the game from the very beginning in order for it to even be made. But I think that the ability to pick up some dude's pistol and fire off a couple rounds before throwing it away really doesn't add anything to the experience. Instead, it just takes away from it because now the game can put you in a room with a bunch of armed forces that can completely disintegrate you in a matter of seconds and act like you'll be having a blast because you can totally go around shooting and poking everyone until they're dead because isn't that just badass? It feels bad, it looks awkward, and it slows things down in a negative way. Most players I've seen opt to not even engage in the combat if they have the choice, but then you're also put into these kinds of situations that I mentioned earlier where you just have a couple of seconds to figure out what to do before melting under a haze of gunfire. So often your patience is just eroded until you finally decide to pick up a gun and kill everyone in the room so that you can actually progress. So yeah, I'm on board with the criticisms here. And in fact, I'm pretty much in agreement with the majority of people on these games in general, I think. They get a lot of things wrong, and they could be better in so many ways. I don't think they're perfect or even necessarily great games. I just think that I like them more than most people do. Interestingly though, while it was only modestly received by many people at the time, Mirror's Edge went on to become a bit of a cult classic. Going forward, you'd occasionally hear reference of the game every once in a while, and it felt like each time I would hear it that it would be spoken about more and more favorably, little by little. Maybe that's just because the series would go on for years without ever being mentioned again that made it seem like this oddity of a game with all these fresh ideas that was ahead of its time, a hidden gem kind of status, you know? Or maybe I'm just misremembering things and there was a sizable and passionate community singing the game's praises from the very start. Either way, it was about another 5 years before we would ever get word that another game was even in development, which was a really cool thing to hear at the time for all of us fans that thought we would never get to see a continuation of the series, especially after the news in like 2011 that Mirror's Edge 2 was cancelled after a prototype was rejected by EA or something. But no, sure enough, after a super brisk 8-year wait, we would see the release of the pre-boot game Mirror's Edge Catalyst, which I believe is an improvement to the first one in almost every single way. I'm apparently in the minority on that though. Even with the very modest reception of the first game, this one didn't even match that in the eyes of most people, at least critically. Now, a lot of the market is bound to change over the course of 8 years, with the landscape of gaming having seen plenty of innovations and consumers' expectations just changing a lot over time in general, so it is tough to gauge how people feel about the two games compared to one another from just looking at review scores. Having played both of them again this week though, I can certainly tell you which one I thought was better. I already did, actually. Now, if you ask me which game I thought was better at the time of release, then I don't know, dude, it was like 9 years ago. Pretty much everything that was in the first game that was good is in this game and is done better, I think. Pretty much everything that sucked about the first game is in this game, but is done better. I think the movement feels better, faster, and it doesn't overdo those annoying speed lines across the screen like this is a goddamn comic book. The combat is leagues better, the visuals are better, of course, but there's also more variety in the aesthetic and the art style has been expanded upon. The environments are more appealing to run through, and they cut down on all of the slow stuff that the first game would have you doing, like shimmying under and across edges, and there's a lot more in the game just content-wise. There's also the change in that Catalyst is set in an open world. Honestly, the formula of the first game hasn't really been tampered with much, so the change to open world is probably the first talking point anyone will be likely to bring up when discussing the game. The change to open world means that there's more of an emphasis on exploration and just kind of absorbing the setting, which I think just totally highlights the strengths of both the setting and the mechanics of the game. Instead of being a series of chapters with very defined starting and ending points with small deviations you can take somewhere in the middle, Catalyst instead puts you in this gorgeous setting with all of the tools you need to climb everything around you and explore all around at your own pace. This connects with me so much more and feels like what a solid parkour system is meant to be used for. The feeling of staring up at a building and just being like, yeah, let's find out how to get there. And I think the game does a good job of letting you adventure to a lot of the areas that you'll see around. Not everything, certainly, and maybe this is just anecdotal and due to my expectations being too low going into the game, but I was pretty consistently finding myself surprised at how many of the buildings around me I could actually get to. There are some cases of invisible walls for sure, but overall I was pretty happy with how the open world felt. I've seen mention of how there tend to be very specific funnels from one section of the world to the other, and how you can't just cut from one district to the other at any point. And hey, if that bugs you, that's fair. It was never really something I cared about personally, and I don't think there's much of an objective, quantifiable reason for that. I just don't really mind. I just see it as how the game goes, like Jet Set Radio or Mario or something, which would have a hub world in between zones that connected everything, instead of just being able to get to anywhere from everywhere. I can acknowledge that it would be cool and feel more open if you could do that here, but not being able to honestly just doesn't upset me at all. The open world also strengthens the time trials completely, I thought, and it's particularly cool that players themselves can step in and create their own races, so there's much more to do if you're into these time trials. And players can create theirs to revolve around as simple or advanced movement options as they want to. I came across quite a few that seem to exist just to showcase an interesting movement technique somebody found, and by being able to view their ghost, it can turn into an interesting learning experience. Granted, ghosts were in the last game too, and they were just as helpful there. Ultimately, I think that if you're in the right mindset for it, the city itself is a compelling enough reason and enough of a justification for the game to be an open world. If you want the world to be utilized as a playground to host a ton of other separate interesting things to do though, then you'll probably be disappointed. The game has a ton of stuff to find, but it's all pretty shallow. This definitely isn't a Grand Theft Auto or anything, where you'd have a ton of different stuff to do in a more sandboxy kind of environment. Mirror's Edge Catalyst is still very much about running and climbing over obstacles, and pretty much every single mission and collectible and thing to do in the game comes down to either getting from point A to B, getting from point A to B as quickly as possible, or figuring out how to get from point A to B. Many of the side quests are not only redundant, but straight up nonsensical. Most of them just require you to race from one spot to the other, but there's never a good in-universe reason for this gameplay requirements. For it to be timed or like a speedy thing. Oh, oi, help! I need you to deliver this clarinet to my friend across the city in 3 minutes. Yo, you need to transport this thingy-bobber to an identical machine about 3 feet away, and if you're 1 moment late, then don't bother. A lot of the collectibles are pretty unrewarding themselves too, so outside of being an incentive to get you started on a path to really just scouting out the areas, they're pretty bad. All of them give you experience to buy skills with, because that's a thing now, but the whole system is pretty damn inconsequential as well, so that doesn't matter. There are like, 5 different kinds of collectibles in this game? But most of them are so similar in gameplay terms that there's really no point in having so many of them or differentiating them. The grid leaks are the most unique in that they're the only collectible that are intended to be picked up without slowing the player down, and their purpose is to highlight paths throughout the world that the player can take. They are essentially the developers being like, hi, in case it looks too far, don't worry, you can totally make this jump. Then you've got memory chips, documents, and recordings, which are all pretty boring. The computer memory chip things are the worst because they seem to be littered absolutely everywhere, but mostly just in plain sight, and they don't have any purpose other than just as a way to trade a couple of seconds of your life for a bit of experience you don't care about. These are so ubiquitous that often I find myself just ignoring them because I didn't want to slow down every couple of feet to pick one up. I've heard the sentiment of, oh, the collectibles in Catalyst are awful because they require you to stop moving, oh my god, which just sounds ridiculous, and I feel like I should inform you that you're not playing fucking Speed the video game. It's okay to stop for a second or two every once in a while to smell the roses. I think you often need something to break up the pacing from just running at full speed all the time, and maybe that's what they were going for with these especially. That said, I think that it's a totally fine criticism if you're talking about this one type of collectible specifically, just because they are so common, so worthless, and they force you to sit through an animation every single time. As opposed to the messenger bags, which are by far my favorite, because they're actually hidden, and so they have a little bit of challenge to them as you have to locate them and then figure out how to get to them. Or that's the idea anyway. They can often be pretty easy to stumble upon anyway, but some of them are pretty fun to look for. These were in the first game too, where they're actually done a bit better I thought, because they usually had these little notes or drawings from the other runners that stashed them there, which was cute and fun and added some flavor to the world. So the main story missions in Catalyst take place in areas that can't be accessed from the open world. So if you do think that the open world is unfulfilling and repetitive to traverse, then you can just go from mission to mission and still have what is pretty much the Mirror's Edge 1 experience, which I feel like is a fair compromise. They've got their own unique layouts, they've got their own collectibles to find, and they've got plenty of people yelling in your ear about stuff that's hard to focus on while you're trying not to run off of cliffs like a lemming, just like the first game. And just like the first game, the story in this one is pretty not amazing. Depending on who you ask, they might have pulled it off a bit better this time, but it's still just not anything noteworthy. They got rid of the animated style because a lot of people didn't like that, but they still have a bunch of archetypical characters that don't really have much personality outside of their assigned role and purpose in the story. There were some moments that I liked here and there, but overall things were pretty bland or just kind of bad. Also, quick nitpick. Why does it keep pulling me out of the game to zoom out and show me stuff? Like, whoa, check out how awesome this view is, aren't you impressed? Well, yeah, Mirror's Edge Catalyst, I was until you tried to force me to be, but now I feel like maybe I think you're ugly just to spite you. Also, I really wish stories would stop trying to force world-changing consequences into every single story because that's automatically more engaging, right? Haha. But anyway, that's a different video or something. You also have to complete certain story missions in order to unlock some of your movement abilities, which also acts as a way to kind of content lock the player away from certain districts until they've gotten far enough into the story. I actually don't really have an opinion on this, and I'm mostly just mentioning it as a way to segue into talking about the skill tree. The Mirror's Edge Catalyst skill tree is not good. It feels totally obligatory and totally passionless, which is interesting because it was part of the game's design process from the very start of development, but there you go. The biggest problem with this skill tree is just that it would be so at odds with the kind of game this is no matter what they did with it. Because this game gives you the option to be participating in races and time trials from the start. If you had major improvements to your character over time, then it would just completely neuter the early game and be super frustrating. They actually already do this a little bit because you can upgrade how fast you can climb poles and slide, but these are fairly minor, so it's not really as noticeable as it would be otherwise. So you have either actual sizable improvements to your movement, which causes all of these problems, or you don't allow anything substantial to be gained, at which point the entire system is so boring that it's boring. They ended up somewhere in the middle of these two sides in the end, but more towards being boring and vapid, I would say. They do actually have some important movement elements locked behind leveling, but you can get them so early on that it more just feels like an awkward, extended tutorial section in the beginning without them or something. Other than that, I was never really excited to level up. Plenty of times I didn't even bother doing it until I could actually spend multiple levels at once, at which point I would just choose skills pretty much at random. Maybe if the combat was really cool and really fun in this game, then they could have a bunch of unlocks that give you rad new attacks or whatever, but even then it might just feel like the focus of the game was being pulled in two different directions too much. And that would be in a world where the developers had so much more time to make a really good fighting system in the first place. So, I don't think a good skill tree was ever in the cards. I imagine replacing experience with some kind of arbitrary currency that could be spent on customizing your appearance or something might have been better if they really needed something to reward you with for doing collectibles and all that. Kind of like a much more elaborate version of what they dip their feet into with the player billboard logos, because that system as it stands is cute but not very deep at all. Also, what's up with only being able to change that stuff from their website outside of the game? Damn good way to ensure most of your player base never touches it, EA. So far we've got a game with great core mechanics and a bunch of fluff on top of those core mechanics that doesn't really add much to the experience. And then there's combat. Combat was also not very well received in this game, but it's a much more complicated problem here. In the first Mirror's Edge, the combat felt pretty soulless and obligatory. It felt like it was just rather thoughtlessly dropped into the game so that a checkbox could be ticked. In this game, the combat was so much more closely tied to the core gameplay mechanics themselves and felt much more connected to everything. It's kind of sad that it still ended up being subpar because the developers clearly took the effort to step back and reevaluate how they could incorporate such a system into the game so that it fit. And in a lot of ways, I think they completely succeeded. It was clearly designed to work in conjunction with the running and moving this time. Faith can't even pick up a gun here, so you're encouraged instead to zip around the levels and use your momentum to knock people's lights out. Attacking from greater speeds and heights inflicts more damage, and you can specifically aim to knock people off of ledges and into objects or cover. There's even a mechanic that gives you a kind of invisible shield that shrugs off damage from bullets and stuff when you're actively running and jumping around the environment, meaning that choosing to flee instead of fight is now completely viable and accounted for. And when used in these ways, the combat can actually feel not just acceptable, but good, maybe even great at the very best of times. So why does half the player base hate the combat, you ask? Well, hopefully inquisitive viewer, it's because they force it upon you. Despite giving you all of these tools to interconnect the combat system with the parkour system, the game will still, time and time again, lock you into a room or arena with a bunch of soldiers and completely halt your progress until you dispatch every single one of them. So instead of running from rooftop to rooftop, ziplining over the bustling streets below, maybe sidekicking some dude out of your way without even stopping, which feels awesome, you're just circling around a pack of police officers, kicking them into each other like bowling pins. Like you're nerve striking their shoulder and where the "I don't know how to walk anymore" pressure point is located. And when you've got to fight stronger enemies, you know what you're doing? You're running up a wall so that you can jump kick them over and over again because that does more damage. And it looks stupid, it feels dumb, and it's not fun. It completely highlights all the silliness of the combat system that's usually obscured when you're interspersing it with the parkour. The game feels so conflicted about it too. Like in the beginning and throughout most of the open world, it seems to be downright encouraging of you to do simple hit and run strategies, but it's almost as if they realized halfway through the story that giving their current platforming mechanics a proper difficulty curve was really tough, or that they needed to pad out the completion time of the game or something, so they just throw in a bunch of battle arenas and call it a day. But when you force combat like that, you're putting yourself between a rock and a hard place because, again, the combat system doesn't really work as a solo focus, and if the environment is too open, then there's nothing to parkour off of, and the enemies are too far away, or they're difficult to cut around to the right spots, which leads to just pure combat without obstacles, which is just so awkward. Or it's too crowded and enclosed, which leads to people clipping through everything and bumping into everything, and you trying to set up jump attacks and stuff that go right over their heads, and it's also super awkward. It's also just a bit hard to take seriously sometimes when you've got this small Asian chick running around completely destroying a room of trained armed soldiers and people equipped so well that they look like B-list Marvel villains. With all this negativity out of the way though, again, I do want to say that I appreciate the efforts that were made to tailor the fighting system to better suit a Mirror's Edge game. It does feel way better than the first attempt, and I think that more polish and emphasis on a more brief hit and run kind of encounter system would be really great. When played this way in the open world, I already think that it can lead to some really fun moments where you just feel like a wrecking ball slamming down anyone caught in your path as you speed through the city. And have I even talked about the city itself yet? Because goddamn does it look awesome. I guess it might be kind of an awkward point to bring it up because I've been showing gameplay footage of it for a while now, but I do want to mention it because this is seriously a massive reason as to why I find this game so enjoyable. It's just such a cool setting and everything about it appeals to me so much and gets me immersed into this game. While the first one looks cool, mostly from just being carried by the art design, Catalyst looks seriously just so good. Technically, artistically, any way you want to slice it, it looks just so good. If you don't think this game looks just so good, then dude, stop watching and leave me forever, because not only can we not be friends, but we aren't even compatible for a passive YouTube viewer relationship. Honestly, I'm sorry, it was never bound to work out. Catalyst takes what was interesting about the first game visually and expands upon it while keeping the feeling of the original at its core. You've got your pure clean whites stripped with all these crazy colors, but you also have giant blinding billboards and ads flooding the rooftops with color and a consistent visual background noise that reinforces the overly corporate setting. You have these little droids flying around and clinging to windows, adding a harder sci-fi element to the skies and making things feel a bit more lively while also adding plausibility for how everything is so overbearingly clean everywhere. The color-coded levels, which this time is more of a district kind of thing, are still intact in the game, but now there actually is an architectural difference between areas as well. Downtown looks similar to the first game, then you have the Crystal Valley district, which incorporates a ton of glass and pools of water everywhere, to the more enclosed construction district, which has altogether unfinished building interiors and dirty ground level areas. There are even a few missions and zones which are a pretty large departure from the classic aesthetic, feeling at times more like something out of the Aperture Science Labs and Portal than a Mirror's Edge game, but they don't overstay their welcome to the point where they overthrow the unique vibes of Mirror's Edge. So, I think the game does a really good job of everything from a graphical and art style standpoint. Though, I will concede that there are some problems, like there aren't many recognizable landmarks that help you keep track of where you are in relation to everything else. The lighting especially deserves some props, I think, because it feels like the foundation for everything else visually, and it's probably the focal point of the graphics, in my opinion. A lot of care went into getting the lighting right, and it really shows. The open world has a full day-night cycle, which both look really good in really different ways, and give the areas pretty drastically different vibes, to the point where I almost sometimes didn't recognize areas I'd been to before. How the tall skyscrapers would totally eclipse entire areas in shadow, or the blinding illumination of a video ad in the dead of night. It looks so good. Again, it's a really big factor in what immerses me into this fictional setting so much. It's like a hyper-stylized version of how I felt hanging out on rooftops in my own hometown late at night. And I'm really thankful to be able to get something in the same ballpark as that feeling from a video game. I may have played the first Mirror's Edge game because I was a complete poser that was interested in anything that flaunted freerunning or parkour in it, but I played the second one because what I ended up with was a unique gaming experience that I've never quite been able to get anywhere else. These games have tons of flaws, but also a lot of heart and plenty of interesting ideas to offer. I don't know if there's ever going to be a Mirror's Edge 3. It took EA 8 years to try their luck with Catalyst, and it's hard to tell if they're satisfied with how well the world received it. Of course, I'd love to see another one. One more try at really nailing and perfecting all the different components and winning over the hearts and minds of the public at large. But even if that never happens, I'm really glad they took a chance with making these games in the first place. Whether or not they're remembered by most 10 years from now, I can at least promise they won't be forgotten. Thanks for watching.